Let's keep the party going. And speaking of controversy, we have probably our most controversial segment yet on the podcast, I would say. I don't know if you want to weigh in on this.
I think that this is going to be something that will leave us with some irate listeners, and others will be going, "Oh, interesting take," because it definitely is an interesting take. But you'll be the one setting out your stall today, Rupert. What have you got for us with this next little segment?
So it's something that I've been thinking about a lot. It just kind of occurred to me a couple of years ago, and it stayed with me, and it's not something that I've really seen anywhere else. But it's basically about how Alex Ferguson kind of ruined Manchester United when he left.
Okay.
Or set them up to fail.
So you think the current state of Man United is, would you say, chiefly due to Alex Ferguson?
I'm not going to make that claim. I'm going to say, like, very comfortably, at least in part.
So at the very least, he set things in motion to where they are now.
Yeah. So I've got a little bit prepared here. So the argument is basically that Alex Ferguson's only interest in finishing his career was getting a limping Manchester United over the line to win the Premier League one last time, disregarding club legacy and leaving a good job to inherit for the next person to take over for the sake of his personal legacy of winning titles.
I mean, that right there, if that hasn't got, like, a couple of Manchester United fans smashing at the keyboard already, I don't know what will.
So, okay, well, let's also make some assertions to start with.
Okay.
I am in no way disputing the fact that Alex Ferguson is an ironclad legend of the game and of Manchester United. This is not intended to break that down or dismiss it, but more to paint him in the light he should be remembered in my opinion, which is that he did great things as a manager, which might well never be rivaled in the English game, but that his handover completely screwed up Manchester United, and he should shoulder at least part of that responsibility.
Okay, that's interesting. How do you think that, can you give some examples of his sort of final seasons and what he failed to do to sort of stop the ship from going down?
Sure thing. So I've put it into three loose categories. The first one is the last season. The second one is the handover, and then the last one is since then.
Okay.
So his final season at Manchester United, his entire core players were incredibly old, and he did very little to try and replace them. Let's take a look at the numbers. Ryan Giggs, by the end of 2012-2013, was turning 40. Nemanja Vidic was 32. Robin van Persie, an ageing striker who'd just been brought in, was 30. Rio Ferdinand, 35. Patrice Evra, 32. Michael Carrick, 32. And Dimitar Berbatov, 32 as well. Wayne Rooney is the only notable exception at 28. The other one you could look at now would be David De Gea, who was 23, but he wasn't very good at the time, so I'm not going to count him. They had a serious structural problem in midfield, but were content to just rely on Robin van Persie to score more goals than the opposition, essentially. And they prioritised the league over the Champions League. So in February of their winning campaign, after a City loss to Southampton 3-1, they decided to put all of their eggs into the Premier League basket and just go for that title and try and capitalise on that loss of points rather than challenge Real Madrid in the Champions League final. So there was a real moment where they pivoted, and instead of fielding a weakened side against Everton for the midweek game, they fielded a full strength side and never looked back. Part of me is kind of fine with that because it's a pretty natural thing to do when you are in the middle of a season, to basically prioritise one competition over another. But I do feel like Champions League success brings in players in a way that domestic titles doesn't.
Sure.
So in that sense, I would maybe, it might be unfair, but I would slightly suggest that Ferguson focusing on domestic success, which is what his career was built on, was maybe a little bit selfish. Let's also take a quick minute to talk about a great young player who was coming through the academy at the time, which was Paul Pogba.
Right.
So Paul Pogba is quite an anomaly in transfers, I would say, in that he left in 2012 because he decided not to sign a contract. And
because he wanted more playing time.
Because he wanted more playing time. He was 18, 19 at the time. And so it's pretty normal for a player not to be getting game time, right?
Sure.
That's standard. Where he differs from the norm is that he left for Juventus, another top European side, and immediately started playing 90 minutes every week.
Yeah,
and that to me indicates that he was just completely neglected and looked over. And I think he is the perfect example of the kind of player that Sir Alex Ferguson was not interested in because he did not care about setting up a legacy. It was literally just about short-term success.
Yeah, I think that's a... You've
Questions?
argued that very well, and I think you'll definitely have at least turned the heads of some of our listeners. But just to play devil's advocate a little bit, and also supply some counter argument. I look at a lot of those things that you've referenced, and they are true. I think it's definitely true about the aging squad and the fact that the future wasn't planned for, and the fact that, responsibility was being sort of just completely ignored of sort of setting up, the legacy. But what I would ask is, A, is this something that we've only ever seen at United? And B, was that a Ferguson-specific problem? Because I would argue that is something that very often happens at the end of huge eras. For me, you look at these several colossal clubs that have huge declines when their golden crop of players retire or get too old. You've got Milan is one huge example, when obviously Zlatan Ibrahimovic and Thiago Silva and Inzaghi and Gattuso all sort of left and retired in the same window. Arsenal, of course, are a massive example when, you had Henry and Vieira and Petit and all those players sort of departing in the same sort of, time frame. Dortmund, to a lesser extent, had it towards the back end of the Klopp era there. And currently, we're potentially maybe seeing the same thing happening to Barcelona and Real Madrid, who are seeing the ill effects of, obviously, for Barcelona, Lionel Messi getting older and being, less effective, and Xavi and Iniesta both having left. Obviously for Real Madrid, Cristiano Ronaldo left, and Benzema's getting a little bit older, and Kroos and Modric aren't looking quite as shiny and effective as they were in recent years. So yeah, is this something that you could completely look at Ferguson for doing, or is it just one of those things, everyone has their moment in the sun, and eventually you have to run out of steam, because you can't keep being the big bad, top of the game boys forever, essentially?
Yeah, sure. So, great to bring up those examples. I think, obviously, we can't sit here and discuss all of them in detail because they all have really individual, specific situations. The main thing I would say is that I think the big difference is that it wasn't a player exodus, it was a manager exodus. And him leaving and just basically dropping the club as he went was the result of the decline of Manchester United. He had given up on his job of maintaining long-term success. That's the main part, and he as a manager had that failing rather than a bunch of big players decided to leave.
That's true to an extent, and obviously someone as massively iconic as Ferguson, who is arguably the best manager to ever manage ever, and for me is probably the best manager to manage in the Premier League at least. But at the same time, Ferguson left in 2013. In 2014, that start of the season, Vidic, Ferdinand and Evra all left in the same window, which for me is one of the greatest footballing failures of all time. Part of that is on Ferguson for not sort of scouting enough replacements, and the people they had sort of coming in for Vidic and Ferdinand were Phil Jones and Chris Smalling, which, let's see how that ended up. And then Marcus Rojo and Dali Blind came in to sort of, bolster that squad. So It's not really a like-for-like replacement. But the club hierarchy has to take some of that blame. Ferguson left a year prior, and you've lost, as you said, it's a manager exodus. To lose Ferguson is one thing. You've lost an absolutely legendary manager. The morale he brought, the tactical strength he brought, all that was massive. But you've also lost three enormous leadership figures from the squad all at once. At the same time, Ryan Giggs retired. Paul Scholes had retired the season before. Giggs stayed on as assistant, but you've lost all these massive figures in the dressing room. And you look at some of these replacements, adding on to the ones I mentioned earlier, they had 18-year-old Luke Shaw come in from Southampton and 19-year-old Paddy McNair come in. Luke Shaw, he's had a pretty underwhelming career at United, but even if he'd come in and hit the ground absolutely running and been exceptional and been, kind of like what someone like Mason Greenwood is kind of looking like he is for them at the moment, he's never going to be a like-for-like replacement for all the things that someone like Patrice Evra brought to the club. Even if he absolutely has a 10 out of 10 game every week, you can't possibly expect him to replace him. So I think it's one of those things that, yes, Ferguson failed to update the squad in the right ways to keep them competitive after he left, but also so did the board, and they allowed all these players. I would have never, ever, ever thought that a club as successfully run as Manchester United could allow Vidic and Ferdinand to leave at the same time. adding on Everett as well as another part of that backfield, but a centre-back partnership that was so, vital to how successful they were. Letting them leave at the same time, not letting one leave and then allowing the other to sort of, tutor up his replacement. And I think a great example of the opposite of what Manchester United did, and something that I think needs to be praised, is how Liverpool spent like 2 or 3 years grooming Jordan Henderson to be Steven Gerrard's heir. Not just a Klopp initiative, obviously, because it happened over the course of several different managers. He was signed by Kenny Dalglish. He played under Brendan Rodgers as vice-captain and acting captain for a lot of the games, and then became captain just before Klopp joined. But I think that is the way that you can intelligently view, Liverpool and Steven Gerrard are kind of synonymous. He's potentially, their most iconic player, but they didn't go, right, let's put all our eggs in this basket, and then when he retires, be dangled over the edge. They spent all this time slowly and surely sort of nurturing and making sure Jordan Henderson was ready to come, deputising under Steven Gerrard, and now he's led them to a Premier League and a Champions League.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think one problem that you've done right now, Cam, is that you've made your arguments after the first of my 3 points. So I will cover parts of that. I'm obviously going to talk about the fact that it's not all of his fault and the club has to bear a lot of the responsibility as well. But I think that it's only going to play into my favour that you brought up someone like Jordan Henderson, because let's now talk about the handover, which was incredibly abrupt. He announced that he would be retiring in May, just 2.5 weeks after they won the title. At that point in mid-May, Everton hadn't even received a formal approach from Manchester United about getting David Moyes, despite the fact that he was the first choice.
Right, which suggests that his announcement wasn't just public and it had been sort of in the works for ages, but it came abruptly all at once to even United themselves.
Yeah, he just decided, because he had won the title, that he was going to retire.
Which is, it doesn't look good.
And there was no, what 3-year replacement will I nurture in? And I've thought about this for a long time. When I looked at all these managers that came in, particularly David Moyes, I thought, why was there not a crossover year where David Moyes was assistant manager to Alex Ferguson and then just naturally took over when Ferguson retired at the end of the year, or even at the end of 2 years? There was none of that. Ferguson just went, great, I've won, I'm out. Bye-bye.
Yeah, or maybe not assistant manager, because I suppose someone like David Moyes probably wouldn't have taken the assistant manager job, but even something like Ferguson being director of football, or I guess, to be honest, even with assistant manager, it's not unfeasible that for a job as colossal as managing Manchester United, you'd take the, step down before you came up.
Yeah, exactly. Or even joint managers, or some sort of transitionary period, and that just wasn't done. And I'm confident that energy of just a lack of preparation was completely because Sir Alex Ferguson was like, cool, I've won it, I'm out. So I think that's pretty damning. He moved immediately into the shadows and, didn't take much of a part in the club after that. There are 2 ways you could read that. One, that he wanted to give the new manager the best chance of succeeding. He wanted to make way, not hang around like a bad smell. But the other way you could see it is just that he peaced out and left. All he did was show up to all of the games. Yes, to enjoy them as a fan, but a side effect of that was also that the cameras could pan to him dramatically at every goal conceded and question whether he would approve and so on. And no matter how innocent that is, it's still unhelpful and it's still really undermining.
Yeah, sure, and you never get your chance to sort of put no manager has really made Manchester United his. You know how people talk about Jose Mourinho's Spurs or Pep Guardiola's Man City? It's never been anything but Ferguson's United since he left.
Exactly. When you think of Milan, for example, you think of all of those players and not the manager, at least in my mind. Just as a small example. Yeah. So since he left, his only real activity in the club's affairs has been more recent. So he showed Jude Bellingham round the stadium in 2020 and has had meetings with Solskjaer over the last year and a half. But before then, he had absolutely no inclusion. He took a job as a non-executive director and a club ambassador for more than £2 million a year and just completely ignored all other affairs, which, you could make an argument for right or wrong, but he did very little to help and was very passive in that sense. So to conclude, I have tried to mention the counterpoints. And, I get the idea that he's allowed to want to end on a high. I do understand the notion that you might have wanted to make way fully and completely for the new incoming manager. But I do believe that it is undeniable that he only resigned when he did because he won the title one last time. And that the entire core of the squad were at the end of their competitive careers. And he did nothing to support the manager that replaced him other than turning up in the crowd to watch the games. So, Fergie, you cared more about your own legacy than your club's, and 7 years on, it still massively shows. Should he take the blame for Manchester United's failings since his departure? No, of course not. Not all the blame. Managers to come fail to live up to expectations. It's the responsibility of everyone at the club to prepare for a transition like Ferguson leaving after so many years. But he was absolutely, categorically part of the problem and not the solution. And I do think that we should remember him as such. An incredible manager, the likes of which we may never see again, but one that just completely mishandled his retirement.
Yeah, very, very passionately argued. I'm inclined to absolutely agree with you. And, just from a personal perspective, I think it's interesting to add on. I just wanted to sort of add to your point there about the handover, because I think it's very interesting the way that it was handled in terms of, the immediacy, but also the selection itself. And I think David Moyes is a fine manager. He's decent. He obviously wasn't anywhere near prepared enough to take on the Manchester United job. And I remember at the time, there was a lot of discussion as to why he was selected. Why was it that instead of going for someone who had managed these big blockbuster clubs like Manchester United, he went for someone who was managing, a decent Everton side, but not a side that was winning any sort of, honours. And a lot of the allegation there was that he'd done it because they were kind of kindred spirits. Not only both Scots, but they're both Protestants as well, I believe. And it was sort of seen as like a bit of a, not boys club is the wrong word, but, and not even necessarily, nepotism, but sort of like keeping it within the circle. And that certainly, set them back several years. I've always slightly privately held the view that Louis van Gaal, if he'd started after Alex Ferguson, could have done a job and wasn't really given enough time. But I think Moyes kind of set them back to the point where they needed not only to be dug out from the Ferguson years, but also then on top of that, the Moyes years.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure that I will have stoked the fires, and I think it's great that this is one of the first episodes that you've given our email address at the top. So thanks for that, Cameron. I look forward to any contradictory opinions, and also, if you disagree with me, let me know, because I'm more interested in learning more about it than being right. But yeah. There it is. There's my 2 cents.
Well, yeah, of course, yeah. If any passionate United or just football in general fans have some interesting information to counter Rupert or add to his claim, we'll absolutely include it in the next episode or episode following that email because it's interesting.